Just so glad. First of all, thanks for Peggy and for Keller for those introductions. I'm very glad that there's been a night between Jane Rendell's talk and mine, because I realise although we're very good friends, we're the sort of yin and yang of architectural lectures, where she's poised, careful, and structured. My lecture is going to be an impulsive mess. It's like a kind of double espresso lecture because I'm the first on, and I suspect, like with my jacket, you're either going to love it or hate it. So let's start by breaking the first rule of giving a lecture, which is to insult the audience. Many of you in this room would be insulted by this statement because as liberal educators that you don't like to be named as conservative. Students in the room might have Stockholm syndrome and therefore will be in some way associating with their tutors, but maybe there will be some sympathy after Peggy's opening statement. So I need to justify this, and I want to justify this provocation with three pieces of evidence. And I'm going to do this quite quickly. The first half of the lecture is a furious caricature of architecture education, and then I try to pick it up afterwards. So let's go through the rituals, the codes, and the systems of architecture education, starting with the rituals. And clearly the biggest ritual of all, which we all know too well, is that of the jury. And one of the amazing things about architecture education is that it presents itself as progressive, as forward-looking, and in some way contemporary. And yet, throughout the world, every single architecture school I go to, you get the same ritual of the jury, with hardly any variations. And the variations, if there are any, are sort of, well, let's just say the next sequence, when I put these into color, it doesn't really make very much difference. In as much as they rely on a 300-year-old model of how you might assess work. And it always astounds me that when I said at the University of Sheffield that we got rid of the crit, people sort of looked at us like, then if you get rid of the jury, then how can you have architecture education? The reliance on the jury as a system is profound. And the second rule of giving a lecture is don't insult your hosts. But this picture from Yale is, even for an amateur semiotician like me, is so full of clues about how the ritual of the jury leads to certain value systems and certain methods of behavior. So, in the front row, and it is, I'll get to the male bit later, but I mean, you kind of know that this guy's famous because he's doing his hands. A few of the other ones are sort of taking interest, but interestingly, these lot are actually, and this guy in particular, is actually disdainfully not taking any notice of the famous guy. And that's important because he's going to have his 2 minutes of fame a bit later, and he needs to separate himself from the identity of the famous guy. And then look at the body language of these lot. The students are sort of almost in a passive-aggressive stance in relation to the famous guy. But it may be because they're not clever enough to brought in their coffee, because they've been up all night, and this clearly induces within the jury the most stupid thing, which is there's actually no knowledge transfer at all. It's a transfer of power rather than a transfer of knowledge. And there she is, isolated socially and spatially, slightly protected from the famous guy, luckily by the big model. But we've seen this sense of the student always being placed in a position of a potential victim rather than a potential champion. And therefore, this sort of the cliches of the jury come out endlessly, whether it is the statements or then the most important thing is what then the jury does to the student in terms of turning them into the model of the future architect who is that of the passive-aggressive defender of their work. I'm presiding over it all. I don't know if this is Athena, but let's say it is Athena, who is both goddess of war and of wisdom, and certainly the war aspect, I think, is sort of appropriate for the jury, and placed against a wall which is signifying kind of modernity, and therefore, in a beautiful image, I think, this, of the kind of, the jury setting is that of Gideon's eternal present, which is where architecture should be located. So, the first ritual is that of the jury. The second ritual, which is the saddest of all, is that of sacrifice. And so if I show you this, which comes from an American blog site, and if you start to laugh at it, you're laughing in recognition of the tragedy of it. Inasmuch as Peggy's and her colleagues' work has clearly identified, the ritual of the sacrifice within architecture school prepares students for the ritual of sacrifice within the architectural profession. And this is a tragedy. And it is, as Peggy says, it's absolutely our responsibility to address the ritual of sacrifice. And as I said before, for this profession of architecture education, which so prides itself on the notion of being progressive and forward-looking, that we are still relying on the rituals of the Beaux-Arts and the words of the Beaux-Arts, that still, do you use the word charrette here still? I guess you do, which is a cruel and unacceptable mode of behavior. And what one hears endlessly is that what these rituals do is, in a positive way, to prepare students for practice, inasmuch as they are going to encounter juries, they're called clients, and they're going to encounter sacrifice through the exploitation of architectural practice. And although not everybody is as famous as Rem Koolhaas and would have to present their buildings to the Chinese Central Committee, I am told time and time again that the jury does do a kind of form of professional training. But if it does do that, what value systems is it inculcating and developing and perpetuating within the student? It is the value system of the isolated, defensive, passive-aggressive, tribal person, in which the architect is always seen on the back foot in relation to the outside world, rather than engaging with it. And I'd actually there was the Howard Rourke one there, but Will's got that, so I took it off. But of course, the other thing that the jury does in the isolation of the individual is to perpetuate this mythology of the hero figure. I'm not saying anything new at that point. I'm not saying anything new particularly, I'm just putting it brutally. The second aspect of the conservative nature is that of the codes by which we all conduct ourselves, whether it is the codes of patriarchy, and this is really bad research, by the way, but I did just put into Google architecture juries images, and these are the ones that came up. And, you know, there are a lot of men. And this whole notion, and there'll probably be too many men here, I've said that to Peggy, but this whole notion of the patriarchal basis of architecture education is then also played out within the architectural profession. Things are changing. I think that the recent appointments of deans, including here, has been an incredible move forwards. But just remember, in the UK, the first female professor was Christine Hawley at the Bartlett. And that was in the 1980s. The second was Sarah Wigglesworth at Sheffield, my partner. One of the proudest things I did at Sheffield was to encourage a feminist discourse. And even now, there are only about 20 female professors, 5 of whom are in one school, which is Sheffield. So we do have a real problem at an institutional level. And when I say that a patriarchy, of course, embedded in that is all both the cliches but also the nuances of what a patriarchal system invokes as a set of values. Yeah, it's color, black and white doesn't make any difference. The point is made. And how are you? I can't really see you. I mean, that's why I wore this today, because I obviously can't fall into this trap of the black. You can't read that, it's another one. But the biggest code is that of the picture. The production of the picture as the commodity and the output of architecture education is, and the effect of that is profound. And I call, by the way, three-dimensional pictures as well, because they are developed out of pictures. So what is astounding about the use of the picture as a means of production, as a means of assessment, and then as a means of marketization, is that the picture becomes the identity of the person producing it. So if it's produced by Big Joe, it doesn't matter that Big Joe is a fascist as long as he produces lovely pictures. And that sense of the picture having the absolute currency of architecture education is a worrying one. It also places the students in a kind of double bind, in as much as they're both paying to be told how to make pictures, but then their institution monetizes those pictures by displaying them in exhibitions and through other forms of publication. So the student is put in a double bind of both provider of the image, which they're paying to provide the image, and then being exploited by the institution in the way that the pictures are used. And the pictures, of course, are then wrapped very firmly into the code of the spectacle. Now, this is where I do make a caricature, I do realize. So I could say it's difficult to draw pictures of the everyday and make them look good. But that would be a caricature, because in the same year, we didn't realize it, but Deborah was writing Architecture of the Everyday, and Sarah and I were writing The Everyday in Architecture. And so we're a kind of transatlantic race to get the first title out. So there is a sort of sense of a caricature at this moment, but I would say the prevalent aspect of the production of the picture is the production of the spectacle. And Jane, turn your eyes away, please, and don't tell anybody what I'm about to show. But there's a useful website done by the Architecture Foundation, which gathers all the studios of London together. And I took it from just one random school about where they go. You get the picture. You're beginning to get the picture, I think. Whew, they stayed in London, that's good. So this one school colonizes the world as travel agents in order to go to the most exotic location, in order that the students are exposed to exoticism, and then they can come back and draw the exotic spectacle. And clearly this is a diminished form of engagement. There's no way that in a week field trip you can begin to understand the complexities of a socio-economic cultural condition. Interestingly, the RIBA, when they visited Central St. Martin's recently, asked our students why we didn't go on field trips. I love my students. And they said, why would we? What would we learn? And so the students kind of defended us. But this sense of architecture education wanting the spectacle and drawing pictures of it and engaging within it through an image like this is also disturbing. And so if that's the first premise, the second one I think is actually more tough, which is the very stasis, the very conservative nature of architectural education is disguised under this kind of thin veneer of spectacle and of progress. On a yearly basis, From school to school, from year to year, things look different, and therefore the argument is that things must be moving forward. But they're only moving forward under the thrall of a deeply conservative regime. And the final one is the systems of architecture education. And I suppose the main system is still the notion of the master. I've never understood why there should be a connection between being a good architect and a good teacher. In fact, there isn't a connection. And yet that is the assumption, that architecture education should be run by the masters. Because if they've done it, they can tell the students how to do it. And so the history of architecture is, I would argue, a history of puppeteers who are tweaking their students, as I'll talk about later, into forms of gymnastics. And so whether it's Circus Bauhaus, Circus Penn, Circus Cooper Union, Circus Bartlett, and then also what's happening within this is actually what they're dangling first of all is themselves, or images of themselves, the identity of themselves through their buildings. And so these become the ways by which the master passes down his mastery to the others. And this system of control in which the students are left hanging, they're left not allowed to express their own voice, means that they effectively become contained by the school, and the school becomes a prison yard, into Fourier's terms, for the gymnast to play in, to do their twists and turns of spectacular pictures. But that school prison yard is contained by the second system, which is that of the profession, and in particular, the notions of accreditation. Now, accreditation is a really bizarre thing. The accreditation is done by people who used to be quite good, I guess, because that's why they're accrediting. But they've been 30 years out of school. So they're accrediting students who have got 30 years before they reach their level. Yeah? So that's a 60-year gap. But what they're doing through the accreditation process is trying to find what they learned in their school 30 years ago. So the accreditation system builds in, at the very least, a 60-year gap of stasis. It doesn't move things on. And these all come together into what Rainer Banham calls the tribal longhouse. And within the tribal longhouse, these very strange, codified, systematized, ritualized behaviors take place. I once said on radio, and when Architecture Depends came out, I was doing a radio interview on Radio 4, and I said, the trouble with architecture school is that people go in as humans and come out as architects. And I got an absolute barrage of sort of not quite hate email. It was before Twitter really got going, but it would have been certainly that. And within this, I will end this sequence with this really distressing video. I won't play the sound because I haven't put it on, but you will see. It's a famous architect, Günter Dominik.
Des Widerstandes. Ich unterrichte
I've taught at the university for over 20 years,
über 20 Jahre.
and there are, to my knowledge, at least 6 students who have committed suicide because of the lack of these traits.
6 Studenten, die diese Hartnäckigkeit nicht gehabt haben und sich umgebracht haben. Das ist zwar traurig.
It's quite sad, but consequent.
Es hat sich allerdings
In comparison to that, only one single teacher committed suicide, and that is too little.
Okay, it is extreme, but often the extremities of a position reflect the center of the position. And that moment, I think we just need to move on. So I need to change the font. I need to make it smaller. I need to take my name out of it because otherwise I'd be your master. and we need to start again. These are Giddens's reactions to risk society, but I find them really useful as reactions to how to deal with the here and now, whether it's a political situation or, in this case, the status of architecture. So if I take sustained optimism, I'm going to go through it very quickly. The notion that although we're going to hell in the handcart, it's all going to be better. You know, Trump's tweets about growth, it's all going to be better. It may be I'm a racist, misogynist, but we're growing. We're going to sustain the optimism of the world. The second is a pragmatic acceptance, that there's no other way, we're just going to get on with it, we're going to get on with the toxicity of capitalism, we're going to get on with a kind of how can I change the architectural system, et cetera, et cetera. The third, which is the most dangerous, is cynical pessimism, which, as Giddens says, is not a useful or productive mode of operating. And the fourth is that of radical engagement. And I use a quote from Marx here because it's useful. So what might be the architectural equivalents of these? Sustained optimism, I think it's an easy one, it's Dezeen, yeah? In which, I know you all do it, admit to it, that you all go and you need it sometimes to cheer yourselves up, to believe that buildings can exist under shining skies, with descriptions which are always lovely, not surprisingly because they're written by the architects, and there's a sense that actually the world is going to be okay after all. A pragmatic acceptance is the bad bits of the post-critical turn, particularly the Michael Speaks version of it, in which he basically becomes complicit in exactly the forces which I think we should all be resisting. The cynical pessimism, I'm afraid, I don't have an Anthony Giddens quote for that because I just find it in my Twitter feed. The sense, actually, of despair of what's going on. But what we have to believe in, and so all lectures are slightly kind of book sales as well, aren't they, is the sense that there is an alternative, the sense that through radically engaging that potentially you can change. And so I want to go through some of the words that we use, Tatiana Nishat and I used in this book, to try to think about how we might educate otherwise. So I'm going to call it Other Ways of Doing Education, or Educating Otherwise. And Giddens' definition of agency is twofold. First is a positive one. I can intervene in the world, and in that intervention, I can make a change. The second, which is why I call the talk Education Otherwise, is that it presumes you can act otherwise. You escape from the notion of the master. You escape from the notion of the power. You escape from a prescription, and you act otherwise. The world is open to different forms of operation. So I'm going to take you quickly through, I think, 8 acts. And contingency, so contingency, for those of you who've read Architecture Depends, the book is about contingency. And if, in the argument that I make about architecture, which is that architecture depends on all these other external forces and contingencies, but this dependency is so terrifying because it feels threatening and the architect is out of control. What happens is that the holy cross of architecture is held up in order to banish these external dependencies. But, simply put, what happens is the pure body is inevitably going to become impure because these things are going to come back to haunt it. So get used to it. And these words then also potentially, and I could change them endlessly. Oh, I got infrastructure for Keller. These words, you could make up your own, but the argument, I suppose, is that these dependencies in their multiple various ways are also what an architectural education should expose students to. And what I talk about is this sort of overlaying of the hope of architecture, its yearning, with its actuality, and always playing. And in that, you can't fly around the world. In that, you can't just deal with spectacle. In that, one has to acknowledge the power structures which are implicit within architectural education. And I quite like the way that Keynote can't handle the overlay and ends up with this. It ends up different each time. Mess. So at the beginning of Architecture Depends, I put this in. One humorless American critic castigated me, saying, how could this pipsqueak from the UK possibly put himself in the lineage of great masters? It was actually, I didn't write this was graffiti in the toilet block at Cambridge University Architecture School, referring to the fact that I was a hopeless drawer. And at Cambridge University Architecture School, this is absolutely classic. First year, that what you had to do was that you had to trace, I got Mies van der Rohe, yeah? And because if you trace somehow osmotically, a bit of him's going to be transferred into you. I couldn't draw. You students in this room won't understand the word I'm about to use, rapidograph. But there was a direct correlation between how thin a rapidograph you could use and your final grade. Sarah somehow, I've got weird electromagnetic forces in life, which sort of screw up with my rapidograph. I could never get down lower than a 0.35, which, for those of you in the room, means I was a very bad drawer. Sarah was on a 0.13, and so when I was doing Mies, it sort of looked like this, I was shaking the thing. And this is why I sort of have a sort of slight antipathy towards Mies van der Rohe now. I think he permanently, and through the book, the front cover is Mark Wallinger walking around Mies van der Rohe, just gently mucking him up. So, this is mess. So this is the notion that architecture education should engage with the mess and the contingency of everyday life, rather than extracting it and entering into the world of a purified spectacle. Oh, he's gone. Others. This is simply a plea for architectural education to get out of the tribal longhouse. It's a plea to engage with others. It's a plea to listen to the voice of others. And in that, the difficult thing for the master, for the famous, for the person with his hands, is that they have to acknowledge the other's voice. Because in Giddens's terms, which is, again, his term of mutual knowledge, in the engagement with the others, you also have to change the way in which knowledge is deployed. You have to shift it from a knowledge which is a knowledge full of power, a knowledge which is determinist, into a knowledge which is discursive, shared, in which the knowledge of the student as a human about the way they dwell, they live in the world, has the same resonances as the knowledge of the tutor on the other side of the table, or preferably around the table. That also assumes very clearly a notion of ethics. And the description of ethics I use is Bauman's after Levinas. And in that, it's a kind of chain of ethics and a chain of responsibility in which the ethic of the tutor is their responsibility to the student, and in particular the empowering of the student to grow their own ethic so that in their own practice they can take responsibility for the other. And the other is multiple, preferably not the client, because as a lot of architectural lobbies work exposes, is the client is complicit in the construction of some of these exploitative structures, but in terms of the user, in terms of the critic, in terms of other notions of humanity in relation to global warming, and so on and so forth. The next act is that of politics, and an explicit acknowledgement of the political space of architectural education. And not to avoid that, but to take it on. And I don't mean left-right politics, although just at the moment there is clearly an institutional need to begin to state the politics of the institution in terms of the left, in my humble opinion. I mean more the politics of discourse, the politics of space. Most classically, obviously, within the politics of the space of the jury and the power structures that that sets up. Or even the politics of the space like this, in which I stand at the front, I am the master with knowledge, and you lovingly and adoringly look at my jacket and set up a spatial power structure which is deeply political. How does one begin to dissolve the power structures which are implicit within the politics of educational space? So very simply, at Sheffield, did a really simple thing. The tutors always sat at the back, and the student always started the first discussion. The tutor didn't give up their knowledge, because that's a double whammy, but they contributed it in a kind of position of equity. Not one of those pictures showed anything other than the politics of space being played out as the politics of power within the jury. And so this is Jeremy Till, Architecture 101. It's what I do to my first-year students. I just say, I ask this question. What happens if, when you're sitting in front of a computer, or you're sitting with a pencil, you consider every single line, first of all, as the production of a set of social relationships? It will bring along with it form and techniques and everything else. It's a very, very simple thing, and they get it. I think, therefore, quite a powerful thing to say is just remind yourself that every line you draw is to do with the setting of a social relationship. I mean, this is so annoying. Someone drew a line and put the, well, they didn't, but let's say they did a drawing and they put the table there. That sets up a certain set of social relationships. I don't need to tell you this, you're a sophisticated Yale audience, that this sense of the line and the social relationship, which brings along with it, is an explicit acknowledgement of the political space of architecture and therefore also of architecture education. And this is the only bit I have from St. Martin's. As head of the whole thing, I try to back off what's called the Spatial Practices Program, which is run by the brilliant Mel Dodd. And because we're a very young, second youngest after Will's program in London, we felt it important to very, very clearly position ourselves. And Mel came up with this manifesto. And as soon as you say that first thing at the top, I think that changes the way that our students and our staff operate. And it's quite, I don't know any other school in the country, or the world actually, which says that as point number one. This idea of agency, therefore, and its definition of agency in terms of being able to act otherwise, might also suggest a different way by which we define what the architect might do. That both in the UK and in the US, we've had a radical shrinking of the role and territory in which the architect operates. This is the RIBA plan of work, which wonderfully still suggests that the architect is involved at every stage of the process. There's a table under this, and it says, yeah, the architect's going to help in every single stage. But in a classic neoliberal construction, what happens is the various stages are cut up, and then, as Harvard Business School will tell you, you outsource it. And so the architect once was there, but actually this is what has now happened. that each of these moments of the system of architectural production has been outsourced to the marketplace, and different forms of expertise have rushed in. So my hope, and in that then what happens is that the zone of invention is shrunk down to this tiny bit of the world in which effectively architects have been called simply to make respectable the spaces of capital by dressing them up in so-called progressive garb. And my hope is, and this is where I have to have hope, because otherwise I shouldn't be an educator. I have to have optimism, because in a place like St. Martin's, our students are by nature optimistic. Therefore, my hope is that if one looks at, you follow through some of these tenets, and you look at acting otherwise, that one can redescribe what an architect could or might do. And in that redescription, expand the field back outwards again. But you only do that if you get rid of the hold of architecture as a production of pictures or the production of objects. And so, again, I could have, the words that come up here, in a way you should populate these words with your own, because these are just mine, about how you actually reclaim, but through notions of ethics of mutual knowledge, you reclaim the territory by redescribing what an architect might be able to do, or what an architectural student. And in that, you value different forms of knowledge. You value different sets of skills. I'm a good storyteller. I'm a hopeless drawer. If I'd been allowed just to tell stories at Cambridge, they wouldn't have chucked me out, as it were. But the RIBA doesn't like that. The accrediting bodies only want to see pictures. We were given an absolute kicking at Sheffield when we proposed the LIFE project as 25% of our entire curriculum, in which failure was actually valued, because the LIFE projects often went wrong, because the client walked away. The RIBA came in and said, well, where's the architecture? And we said, the architecture is all there. It's about process, it's about collaboration, it's about different ways of engaging with the politics of space. Oh no, we want to see pictures of buildings, please. And so this kind of redescription of what, and the revaluing of what might happen in architecture education, I think is an incredibly important task for us. And the next slide is, I just love the next slide. I was flying over, and the woman next to me on the plane on the way over to Philly this time, to the States, was playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, okay? This is great. Because I said, no, it's all of them. And the final act is just a gentle reminder, but an important reminder that the purpose of education is that of empowerment. Not empowerment of you, not empowerment of your ego, of your practice, of enjoying notions of mimicry through notions of the master, but always a sense of the empowerment of the other. And that's where I still have optimism, because I think the great tutors are doing that. And I just want to end with a quote from Charles and Ray Eames, who were invited to India to advise the Indian government on setting up a school of design, the first school of design. And there were no designers, formally trained designers. Of course, there were lots of designers, but no formally trained designers in India. And so the Eames had a problem, which is to advise the Indian government who should be the first students. And they advised the Indian government that the first students should be architecture graduates. And this is what they said. And on that optimistic note, I end. Thank you.